Lying in bed alone, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the familiar emptiness that had slowly become a part of me. My husband was out late again, and I didn't need an excuse this time. It was just what it was now, another night spent wondering where he was, who he might be with, what secrets he was keeping just out of reach. I couldn't pinpoint when it had all started slipping away, but lately, the silence between us felt like a wall too high to climb. The messages that he said were nothing important, the quick exits when his phone buzzed, every small act only added another stone to that wall. The night dragged on, thick and heavy. I closed my eyes, hoping for sleep, but it was as if even the quiet was judging me for the hollow ache growing inside. The house was still, the tick of the clock loud enough to be maddening. I shifted, tossing in bed, restless and painfully aware of the empty side where my husband should be. Just when I thought I'd be awake all night, a creak at the door made me sit up, heart hammering in my chest. It was my son, standing there in the dim light, a shadow stretching across the floor. He looked concerned, his brows drawn together as he watched me with that quiet, careful look that had always made me feel seen. He stepped closer, his voice low. "I heard you moving around." "Couldn't sleep." "No," I whispered, surprised by the tenderness in his gaze. He was just a young man, my son, but in that moment, he seemed older, steady in a way that I hadn't noticed before. He didn't ask for details, he just settled at the edge of the bed, close enough that I could feel his warmth. It was comforting, the kind of comfort that I hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. He listened as I spoke, as words I hadn't planned to say poured out in a confession of loneliness I hadn't even admitted to myself. I told him how distant everything felt, how empty the night seemed now, how tired I was of the excuses, of the silence that seemed to deepen with each passing day. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to solve it, just listened, a calm presence that let me unravel without judgment. The minutes stretched, his hand resting gently on mine as if to anchor me in the room, away from the dark thoughts that had been my only company. I felt a pang of guilt then, a strange pull that I couldn't name, as if confiding in him blurred a line I wasn't sure I should cross. He was my son, yet in this moment, he was the only one who understood. His hand on mine, his fingers warm and steady, felt like the only real thing in a world that had been unraveling for so long. I knew I shouldn't need this from him, that he shouldn't be the one filling the space my husband had left, but I was too tired to pull away. His presence was a balm, and I let myself lean into it, just this once, telling myself it was harmless. I closed my eyes again, feeling his hand still resting over mine, a silent promise of understanding. The silence no longer felt like a weight, but like something shared, something we didn't need to explain. When he finally stood to leave, a wave of relief and guilt washed over me. I told myself that tonight was just a strange exception, an odd moment born out of 1,000 disappointments. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. As he slipped back into the hall, I lay back down, feeling both comforted and conflicted, aware that what I'd let happen had changed something I couldn't quite name. Days passed, but I found myself thinking back to that night, replaying the comfort I'd felt, the way my son had listened without judgment. The memory felt like a fragile thread, something delicate I wasn't sure I should hold on to, yet I couldn't let it go. He seemed to sense my need, picking up on the smallest details, stepping in quietly when he noticed my silences were growing too long. It was as if he understood things I hadn't even said out loud, a sensitivity that both eased and unsettled me. In the quiet hours, we found ourselves talking more. It started with small things, but gradually, I felt the unspoken weight between us, a kind of understanding that wasn't spoken but was deeply felt. He'd ask how I was, really ask, in a way that made me pause. When I answered, his eyes never left mine, giving me his full attention. There was a sincerity there, an empathy that filled a space I hadn't known was so empty. In his presence, I didn't feel invisible. He looked at me as though I mattered, as though my hurt was real, not something to brush aside. One evening, as we talked, I let my guard down completely, revealing pieces of myself that had long been buried. I told him things I hadn't even told my closest friends, the things I'd kept hidden because they felt too raw. He nodded, listened, his gaze soft but intense. I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. There was a gentleness in his understanding, a patience that soothed me, that made the pain seem bearable, if only for a moment. Sometimes, without thinking, I would reach out, and he'd meet me halfway, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small thing, but each touch felt like an anchor, pulling me back from the edge of despair. I knew it was wrong to lean on him like this, that he wasn't meant to carry my burdens, but I couldn't help it. His presence had become something of a refuge, a shelter from the storm of my own doubts and fears. I would catch myself, guilt seeping in, but he never pulled away. The tension grew in small gestures, quiet glances that lingered just a second too long. A subtle shift, a weight between us that neither acknowledged but both felt. I found myself looking forward to these moments, seeking him out without realizing it, my heart beating faster when he entered the room. There was nothing overt, no grand declarations or gestures, just a deepening closeness, a dependency that felt as natural as it was forbidden. As I spoke to him, bearing parts of myself I hadn't dared to share, I felt the lines begin to blur, felt the boundaries slip ever so slightly. He was no longer just my son. He was something more, my confidant, my anchor, the one person I trusted to hold my vulnerabilities. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, but the need for this connection was overpowering, drowning out the voice of reason. He listened, always so patiently, without judgment, without that look of pity I dreaded from others. There was something grounding in his gaze, a silent assurance that he'd hold my pain, that he understood. And I leaned into it, feeling a strange comfort that defied explanation, something that, deep down, felt as wrong as it did right. In those quiet, stolen moments, I knew this was something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't let anyone else see. It was a solace I craved yet feared, a closeness I couldn't deny, though I knew I should. We both felt the unspoken boundary, and still, neither of us pulled away. It was as though we were dancing around an invisible line, teetering on the edge, both aware but unwilling to break the spell. The intensity grew, and with each passing day, I found myself more entangled in his presence, caught in a web of my own making. That night, I found myself at a breaking point, the weight of everything pressing down on me until it was unbearable. My husband's absence, his indifference, had become too much to keep bottled up, and as I sat there, it all came rushing out. Tears I had held back for weeks, maybe months, slipped down my face, unrelenting, the kind of silent sobs that shake you to the core. I didn't even hear the door open until my son was there, kneeling beside me, his face